How's that? Am I sharing my screen? Yep. Yay. Jolly good. All right. So let me start off with some housekeeping. Welcome to week 12. So let's talk. A couple of you were asking me about these lesson plans. So, and I was waiting to grade your homework. So I've now graded and returned all your homeworks. In each case, I've indicated whether you should or should not consider adding this as one of your 5 lesson plans. You certainly can. Or if you do want to use it, I've suggested the additions or the changes that you need to make in order to make that lesson fit as a good part of your 5-day lesson plan. Now, the final lesson plan assignment that you have to do is due December the 11th, and we won't discuss it any further. Obviously, you asked me if you've got any questions, but it's a unit of 5 50-minute lesson plans that have an underlying rationale in common. Okay, obviously pronunciation lesson plans, not grammar or reading and writing lesson plans. So you imagine that you've got a group of students and you're teaching them for 1 week and you're teaching them every day 1 50-minute lesson plan, okay? So if you do choose to use your, if I've said this lesson plan is excellent, feel free to go ahead and use it as part of your 5-day lesson plan, then obviously you have to stay. You either have to change it and adapt it to a new population, or you have to stay with that population, right? So if you chose to do, 15 Spanish speaking adults in your single lesson plan, then that has to form the underlying rationale for your whole 5 days, because you're going to be working with one group of students. So if you've decided that you want to work with a different group of students, then obviously you're going to have to adapt that single lesson plan you did in order to do that. The rationale needs to be clear for all your 5 plans. So it shouldn't just be a random set of minimal pairs, for example. There should be an underlying rationale connecting each of the lessons in the week. If vowels, what vowels are you doing? Why are you doing them? The same with consonants, the same with prosody. I would caution against doing 5 lesson plans that just dealt with vowels, for example, because frankly, if I was the student, that would be incredibly boring. So I suggest that you mix your focuses between consonants, vowels, and prosody to keep your students interested. Now, of course, the underlying rationale can move from something, and should, from something that's related to something else. So some of you did stressed and unstressed vowels, for example. So you could do a vowel contrast, then you could do how a vowel like the schwa contributes to stress. Then you could move from that to stress in discourse, for example. So you can have a passage of things, but you don't want to be doing, I certainly don't want 5 days of today we're doing and a, and tomorrow we're doing and or, and tomorrow, the next day we're doing, that is not something that would keep your students particularly motivated. So, and then as I said before, if you decide to use this lesson plan you just completed, if I said that's awesome, feel free to use it, then obviously it has to fit the overall rationale. You can't just throw that in as 1 day. It has to fit the overall rationale of the 5 days. All the details and materials need to be included for each lesson, and that was something, most of you got this absolutely spot on, but some of you didn't include them all. That means everything. That means if you're going to use recordings, links to the recordings, If you're going to do homework, it means answers to the homework. It means include the homework and answers to the homework. If you're going to use exercises, it means putting all the exercises in there. If you're going to use PowerPoints, it means putting the PowerPoint in there. Basically, every single thing that you intend to use from Monday through Friday needs to be in those lesson plans for me to see. Also, bear in mind that you want not just a difference in, a variation in foci, but also a variation in the kinds of activities you use, okay? So you don't want to always focus on articulatory activities, right? Like looking at the way the mouth moves or whatever. You can do other things. If you use, you can use things like TED Talks, for example, to do some prosody. If you do that, you need to include the transcription for the TED Talk there, so I can see what it is that you're doing, as well as the link to the TED Talk. Also think carefully about the activities that you choose. The idea is that you really are choosing something that you could do. So you don't, for example, if you're doing homework and you just sort of throw something in there and say, oh, I'll have them transcribe a 5-minute YouTube video, okay, that they choose. Okay, you don't want to do that, right? Because if you've got 20 students and they're all choosing a random 5-minute YouTube video, that means you've got to watch them all and you've got to transcribe them all in order to do it. So that's a real mistake. That's sort of strikes me as someone who's not really thought about the homework and about how they're going to do the homework. So it's better, for example, if you watch a YouTube and have it transcribed, and then everybody works on the same YouTube at home, so that you don't have to go through and transcribe every different thing. Or if you're going to ask people to choose their own TED Talk, think about what it is you're going to ask them to do with that TED Talk, and how effective and efficient you can be in going through that homework. If you're having to look at 15 different TED Talks, don't ask them to do something for 3 minutes, because then that gives you, 3 times 15, that's 45 minutes just listening to TED Talks before you've gotten through any of their work that they've done. So pick your activities carefully, make it look like you've actually thought about how you're going to deal with it, and you've thought about efficiency. Another thing you can do is have half the group do homework on one day and the other half of the group do homework on another day, so that you have, if you have a lot of students, if you have 25 students, you don't want to deal with 25 pieces of homework every day or every other day. So think about how you're going to choose activities, and the reality of what those kinds of activities are going to cost you in terms of student effort and your time. Ideally, you want a lot of student effort with a limited amount of your effort, if you see what I mean, which is why you might want to pre-choose an activity so that you can have it all worked out beforehand. Okay, those are my only pieces of advice, really, about those 5 lesson plans. They should look exactly like this lesson plan was supposed to look. So I've been very specific in my feedback. If you didn't, if you missed something or something wasn't included or whatever, I've told you exactly what the issue is. And so using the feedback for this single day, you should be able to create the 5 lesson plans for the final activity. So does anyone have any questions at this point? If you haven't had a chance to look at your homework yet, go ahead and look at that first. But does anyone have anything that they immediately want to clear up? Okay, good. Well, obviously you'll have plenty of time to ask me questions, and you can ask them anytime. If you think they're going to be useful for the whole group, then always ask them in the virtual office, but you can always ask me, just directly email me too. Okay. And also, of course, although the lesson plan is not due until December the 11th, If you want to sort of do a preview, do a rough draft and let me have a look and get an idea of what your 5 lesson plans are including, then feel free to do that also. Okay, now I had a great question from Emily. Hi, Emily, who I know will be watching this at some point, who did one of the activities that I asked you guys to do from last week. So one of the activities she did was this idea of, we have kind of standard ways in which we use intonation in idiomatic contexts, right? So like if we're going to say a phone number, we tend to say it the same way. 903-408-0086, right? We divide it into 334, and then we have a certain pattern that we use. Now, it's interesting because it's completely different in other languages. They don't choose that same pattern. So Emily said, could you explain the difference between tone and pitch? For example, when I was thinking about the phone number activity, I felt like I used a rising tonic at the end of each of those sets of numbers. But then after, and a falling tone at the end. And then afterwards, I thought, I wonder if I was actually using a high pitch, not a high tone. So this is a great question because it's the difference between tone choice, so falling and rising movement, or whether you're high, mid, or low, right? So the way she's transcribed it here, so 918, that would be a rising tone. 557, 8276, right? If it was a pitch, it would be 918, 557, 8276, right? So in one, and either of those is perfectly fine. I'm not sure which one you would, I think people probably do both. The point is that you have continuing, and then drop. And the continuing could be in a rise tone, or it could be a shift up in pitch. So 918, 557, 8276, or 918, 557, 8276. Okay, now they sound very, very similar. I understand that, but what you're listening for is sort of this difference between versus up, and you just jump up a pitch level. So hopefully, Emily, that will that makes some sense to you. And you could also do both, of course. You could also say 918, 557, but that's sort of a little weird. So because in order to go up, you have to keep, if you're going to do a high pitch and a rise, it would be 918, 557, and you'd go all the way up. So you'd want to do one or the other, 918, 557, or 918, 557, either of those two things. So that hopefully will make some sense to you guys and to Emily. Did anyone have any questions about that? All right. Then in that case, we are going to move to chapters 4 and 5. And we've got the normal PowerPoint. You've got a reading post and a new activity. So let's hop to it. Chapter 4, tone choice. All right. So hopefully you've read this already. And if you haven't, you want to make sure that you go back and look at this chapter very carefully. Tone choice is one of the most important things that you need to deal with as a teacher and that your students will be working with. So we have two types of rising tones, a straight rise or a full rise, two types of falling tones, a straight fall or a rise fall, and a level tone. Now, we're going to come back to the difference between the two types of rises and the two types of falls. So don't worry about that right now. As far as you're concerned, all rises are rises, all types of falls are falls, and then you have a a level tone, right? So this always appears, this tonal movement always appears on the tonic syllable. Sometimes in your textbooks, it's called a focus word, a nuclear stress, or a tonic. It's always the final prominent syllable in the unit. And it stands out from the rest because it's usually longer, louder, and carries a longer pitch movement, right? So instead of having syntactic functions, we are going to look at pragmatic assumptions that go with each of these types of tone choice, right? So falling tones, we talked about this before last week. Falling tones, doesn't matter whether they're fall or rise fall, we use for new assertions or statements. So if you look at the top of the table, you've got every time I've put in a kind of gloss. So a new assertion or world changing, i.e. I'm telling you something new. So when we think of what the speaker is assuming on behalf of the hearer, like we talked about before, the speaker is trying to make a world that the speaker and hearer both understand. If it's a falling tone, the idea is I'm telling you something new. Or it might be, so we're now going down in a line, I've completed my message, I'm done. Right? If you want to talk, you can. It can also be used to highlight authority, right? Because you're giving new information, you're the one that's in charge of the new information. So I'm demonstrating my superior knowledge. And it can also be that the speaker is focused on themselves rather than somebody else. Rising, if you move to the next column, has the opposite kinds of glosses, right? So this is part of our shared background. This is something I'm reminding you of, something that you know. I'm continuing or linking this to my previous unit. So this is part of the same message, okay? As opposed to highlighting my role as authority using a rising tone, I'm building solidarity. I'm highlighting your possible knowledge, right, as the hearer. And it's an inclusive tone. The speaker is focused on the hearer. If you look at the last column in the table, that's this level tone. And I'm temporarily withdrawing. So I'm not indicating whether I think you know this or not. Okay. It's a language sample. I'm not focused on whether I'm communicating well to you or not. Think, for example, that one of the best ways to think about this is children, young children. When you ask young children to read aloud, they're terrible at it, right? They often, they don't know where tone units should end, and they often have a completely flat affect, or they drop when they shouldn't, or, you know, it's clear that they're completely focused on the language sample. They are not focused on the narrative to the hearer, right? Whereas adults, when we tell a story, we try and focus on the hearer and how the narrative fits with the hearer. Also think about what I said last week about prayer, for example. I'm not focused on the communicative message of talking to someone. I'm literally just focused on the language sample of just producing the language, okay? Not focused on my hearer, and I'm neutral in terms of affect, okay? So all those kinds of things go with a level tone. All right, so let's have a look at how that actually works. And you can come back and should come back to that table 4.1, that pragmatic assumptions on a regular basis, to remind yourself of how these tones gloss, and it will make more sense to you that way. So just to give you even more information about that, falling tones are also called proclaiming tones. They declare information as new. The kinds of glosses we've got here, I'm telling you this information, I'm telling you a fact. If you want to think about the kinds of verbs that correlate with falling tones, you can think of verbs like assert, tell, complete, command, instruct, find out. These are all the kinds of pragmatic messages that go along with falling tones. Rising tones are also called referring tones inside the model. And this is, if it's declaring information, it's saying, I'm assuming that you know this already. It's somehow already known or in play. So it glosses as things like, I'm reminding you that you know this. I think that you know this. And the verbs that correlate are verbs like remind, reflect, include, confirm, continue, make sure. Okay, so that's just different ways of having you think about the pragmatic assumptions that go with the tones. They're all the same, and it might be easier for you to think about it in terms of gloss, like I'm telling you this, or it might be easier for you to think about it in terms of the verbs that correlate, like assertion, telling, completion. Whatever way it works for you, those are the pragmatic assumptions and the kinds of glosses that go with those tone choices. So remember also when you're doing this, that this is a projection by the speaker onto the hearer. So for example, when Sarah, I think it was Sarah who was talking to us last week about using rising tone with her kids, that's a classic way of projecting, even if the kids don't know, or it's a classic way of projecting, we're in this together. It's inclusivity, right? It's back up here with this idea of I'm focused on you as the hearer. Here's why I'm using these tones, right? So the speaker isn't necessarily saying, I absolutely know you know this already. What the speaker's saying is, I'm going to talk about this as though you know this already, because it's a way of being more inclusive. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is by way of saying you can't absolutely say what a speaker is going to choose, right? Because it's up to the speaker. The speaker can decide to assert something, to tell you something in a falling tone, or the speaker can decide to be inclusive and talk to you about it in a rising tone. There's no syntactic reason why you would choose one or the other. It's up to you and depends on the pragmatic assumptions that you're bringing as the speaker to the hearer. Okay. All right. Okay. So that said, obviously there are conventions, and the way that Brazel talks about these, the model talks about these, is this idea of social and informational convergence. So the idea is that the speaker and the hearer are moving together, not getting farther apart, okay? So the idea is you're trying to move towards similar understanding, a roughly mutual understanding of the same message, right? So this is called a state of convergence, and it includes not just informational convergence, so not just giving you, saying, this is the information that you need, I assume you know this already, or I assume it is new, but also what's called social convergence. And social convergence is this idea of building solidarity, right? So it's a social bridge building function. And we can manipulate that in the same way as we talked about Sarah, you know, doing it, manipulating it. I mean, not in a bad way, but manipulating it in the classroom. We can also manipulate it in other ways. And it often is manipulated by service people, for example. So they will say something like, does everything taste okay? With a rising tone, okay? What that glosses as is, I'm coming here to confirm that everything tastes okay, right? So you're going to, does everything taste okay? Yeah, everything tastes great, right? And the speaker's like, as I suspected, I assume everything tastes okay, right? In contrast, if the person came up and said, does everything taste okay? Okay, then that is, I'm coming to ask you, does it or doesn't it taste okay? Well, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't, right? If you use the rising tone, does everything taste okay? Then actually the hearer has to denounce that message. The first thing they have to do is say, well, actually, no, it doesn't. So it puts the hearer on the back foot. So next time you're out and about, which probably is not much lately, but when you're in an airplane, if you ever get on one again, when you're in a restaurant, you start to listen to this and you'll hear it. You'll hear that they use this rising tone. I've got an example here that Mark did for me.
Does everything taste okay?
Okay, that you can hear that rising tone, which is sort of an implication for you to say, yes, it does. Yes, we're absolutely fine. Okay, what do textbooks say about rising and falling tones? And the reason I include this as something important is because it's literally almost always about the only thing that textbooks say is WH questions go down and yes, no questions go up. If you haven't met this yet in a pronunciation textbook, no problem. I can guarantee you, you will down the line. And this is sort of what the difference is. We can hear, are you leaving versus why are you leaving? Okay, so yes, no, are you leaving? Yes, no. Why are you leaving? I'm leaving because.
A, are you leaving? B, why are you leaving?
Okay, so there's a definite difference in a yes, no question rising and a WH question falling, but it's not a syntactic reason, which is why your students may say to you, but I can use either. I can use a rising tone or a falling tone on either of those questions. I can say, are you leaving? Or I can say, are you leaving? I can say, why are you leaving? Or I can say, why are you leaving? Okay. There's not a syntactic difference between them. So if you go to your students and you say that the difference between them is the syntax, whether it's yes, no, or whether it's WH, then you're going to find yourself in a spot of bother, because actually the difference between them is pragmatic intent. Okay. So if I say, are you leaving? It glosses as, it looks like you're leaving. Can you confirm that I'm correct? So it's like making sure, it's a confirmation, right? And you're probably saying that because there's some kind of action on the part of the hearer. Maybe it looks like they're packing their bag, or it looks like they're doing something. So you're like, oh, are you leaving? Right? It looks like you are, so tell me that that's happening, okay? We can also hear it when we do that. If someone says, oh, are you leaving? With a rising tone and the person isn't, they will say, oh no, I'm just looking for my ID in my bag. You know, they understand that the assumption is what you're saying when you say, are you leaving? That you're assuming that they've that's what they're doing, and they realize that you've misunderstood one of their actions, and they say, oh no, I'm not leaving yet. Whereas, why are you leaving glosses as something like, I can see you're leaving, but I don't know why. So can you please tell me why? Okay, which is more like this idea of commanding or finding out, like what is happening here. Okay, so the difference is, are you leaving? It looks like you're leaving. Can you confirm that you're leaving? Versus, why are you leaving? Okay, I can see that you're leaving, but now tell me why. So you can look at all questions that have these structures, and that's going to be the underlying pragmatic assumption. So if you change it, you can see the difference in the assumption. So if this is true, if it's not syntax, it's pragmatics, you should be able to have both tone types, right, on both types of questions. depending upon the pragmatic assumption of the speaker. WH questions should be able to go up, or they should be able to go down. Yes, no questions should be able to go up, or they should be able to go down, because it's got nothing to do with whether they're yes, no questions or WH questions. And what we find is that is in fact true. And all the research suggests that barely half of WH questions go down and barely half of yes, no questions go up. So that's why it's a bit of a problem if you use that as the basis for your teaching. In fact, what we find is that it's the pragmatic assumption behind it. So if you have a WH question, okay, I can't find my book. What's it called? I don't know the book you're talking about. Tell me the title of the book. Maybe I've seen it, maybe I haven't, okay? If you say, what's it called? That sounds like, I think I know what book you're talking about, but remind me what the title is, and then I'll tell you if that's true, okay? So you can hear the difference here.
I can't find my book.
What's it called?
I can't find my book.
What's it called? Okay. So that's an underlying pragmatic difference. Same question, but the intonation changes depending upon what the difference is, the pragmatic assumption is. We can do exactly the same thing with yes, no questions. Yes, no questions can go up or they can go down. So if we've got an example of a yes, no question here. Doctor to a patient. Do you feel anxious? Which glosses as, based on your other responses, I think this seems reasonable. Okay, confirm to me that I am correct, that you feel anxious also. Or, do you feel anxious? Which would be new information. This is one of a list of questions I'm asking to get you to tell me yes or no, and I'm not sure what you're going to tell me, yes or no. So we can have a listen to that. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Do you feel anxious? Do you feel anxious?
Okay. So what we find is if we get away from the syntax and we look at the pragmatic assumptions underlying, then we've got a lot more power in terms of how we describe intonation choices. And they don't just stay with questions, they go with absolutely everything, right? And we can increase how we understand whether people use rising or falling tones, and what it is that they're assuming when they use a different tone choice. All right, let's have a look at the final one, which is the level tone, right? So that can either be completely flat or have a slight rise on it, but not a big rise like a rising tone. So this is a little bit different from the rising and the falling, because as we said, it makes the assumption that you're not really interested in whether the speaker knows this or doesn't know this. And this could be for a whole variety of reasons, right? If it's a child reading a story or reading something from a book, they're focused entirely on the language sample. So they just right? So this is the third one here. I'm not focused on the hearer. I'm not concerned with the hearer's knowledge. I'm focused entirely on the language sample. So also the second one, this is a language sample. I'm not focused on the communicative message. I'm not thinking about you as the hearer as I say this, okay? It also can be used as a neutral affect to sort of say, you know, I'm deliberately sounding neutral. But of course, if you deliberately sounding neutral, then your hearer is going to say, depending upon the context, why is this person deliberately sounding neutral? So we'll come to that down here. So some of the most common uses, as we talked about last week, are routinized language. Okay, thanks, you know, just things that happen all the time. Fillers, things like, you know, I have, I mean, you know, or mitigators. Now, mitigators is where we say here, for example, I'm producing a neutral affect. I'm deliberately sounding neutral. Why am I deliberately sounding neutral? Because I'm about to disagree with you, and it's a little warning bell. These are intonational examples of what's called a yes, but strategy, meaning, yes, you're right, but, and then telling them why they're wrong, right? Generally speaking, with adults, we don't say, no, you're wrong. We say, yeah, but, and then we disagree. So this choice of intonation on mitigators like, well, is a sign. It's a signal to say, I'm about to disagree with you, or I'm about to say something that you don't expect. So there are some common uses of that. And then the last thing that your book talks about before pedagogical implications is tonal composition. So essentially what we know is that depending upon the genre, the particular discourse genre, you're going to have different tonal compositions. And it's one way that we recognize things as having different styles, right? If we hear a discourse genre, we can say, oh, that's in the style of. So for example, teaching, we know that we use more falling tones than rising tones in teaching, because usually the teacher is conveying a lot of new information. However, we do use some rising tones in order to do this inclusive bridge building. So if you don't have any rising tones in there, it doesn't sound good. And I've talked about that in the book chapter, what happened with my Chinese ITAs and how they were perceived by the undergraduates as being really unfriendly because there was no rising tones, there was no inclusivity in the information. Conversation tends to have a lot more rising tones as interlocutors are really focused on each other and want to understand what it is, they want to confirm that their hearers understand what they're talking about. So if they're trying to communicate a message, there's often a lot of rights, okays, you know what I mean? And it's all part of this aspect of making sure that we're moving towards each other with social and informational convergence. We're not pushing each other apart. So that applies for lots of things. For example, news broadcasts, if you listen to news broadcasts, they often have lots and lots of falling tones. Speeches, if people are giving new information, will have lots of falling tones. So you can look at lots of different kinds of genres. I've had a couple of students look at preachers, and there can be quite a different aspect in preachers. Some preachers are spending their whole time using rising tones, like, we're in all this together, you know what I mean? This is, you know, Jesus saves, he's saving you, right? You know, or they have a lot of other preachers that go the other way entirely and spend the whole time using falling tones and producing like new information, telling you what you should know, telling you what you should be doing, and instructing you rather than working with you. So it's an interesting thing to sort of take a discourse genre or a clip and look at that. And that's certainly something you can do with your students too, if you want to look at tone choice in that way. Okay. So the last thing in this part is the pedagogical implication. So there's been quite a lot of work, some by me, some by a bunch of other people, all using this model. And with regard to English language learners, we know some things, particularly about lower intermediate level learners. There's often an overuse of falling or level tones with low to intermediate learners, which tends to contribute to them being perceived as unfriendly. This is definitely what was happening with my high intermediate learners in the classroom. But there also might be, in other cases, learners sort of focus on one tone and have just an exclusive overuse of one tone. And this could be a rising tone, this could be a falling tone. More than often it's a falling tone, not a rising tone. But so for example, you have two related propositions. So yesterday I went to the store, and you get yesterday I went to the store, I bought apples, and lots of falling tones, even though these are propositions that should be related to each other. So you either want a slight rise or you want a continuing tone. And the final problem is something that we talked about last week too, which is this lack of a tonal movement. It's having all the prominences sound the same. It's like da 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 da. So then the listener of a traditional English, for example, who's listening for that final movement, that final sustained movement up, down, or level, whichever it may be, can't find that tonic syllable. And because they can't find it, they can't pass the unit properly, and it starts getting difficult to understand what the information is. So that's another very typical problem that that low level or intermediate level learners will have. All the prominences, there's too many of them, and they all sound the same. You can't identify the important one at the end. Okay, so that's a sort of brief run through of chapter 4. Does anyone have any comments or clarifications or questions on that? Anyone have any thoughts about noticing any tone choices? Any of these things sound familiar or not familiar? Nothing. Okay. All right. That's fine. Okay. All right. Let's shift then to chapter 5. So chapter 5 is about key and termination. So this, instead of pitch movement, instead of rise, falling, or level, this has to do with high, mid, or low. Okay. So this is focused on pitch range. And generally speaking, well, so the high is always indicated with the upward arrow, and the low with the downward arrow. Mid is either has a mid arrow or has no indication, because mid is normal. Mid is just like your average pitch range. If you're looking at a tone unit and there's no pitch indicate, you know, you see that there's not a high one or a low one, there's just nothing, then that would transcribe as a mid-level choice. Now, if we go back to this suspension bridge issue, we talked about this last week. Key and termination are the same thing in the sense that they both deal with pitch range, but key appears at the beginning on the first prominence or the onset prominence, and termination appears on the tonic. Okay. So on the tonic syllable, you not only have a falling, rising, or level, you also identify a pitch range. So it could be a high falling, a mid falling, or a low falling, depending upon what you're trying to communicate. Whereas your key is either going to be high, mid, or low. It doesn't have that final tonic syllable movement up or down on it, right? If you don't have a suspension bridge, if you've only got one prominence in the whole unit, everything appears on the termination. That means that you'll have just one pitch range choice, one tonic syllable, one focused word. So if you have multiple prominences, they'll appear between the key and the termination. But the important ones are this one right here, the first one, and the last one. Okay. So what this does, and you can see it here, is it creates a left edge boundary and a right edge boundary to each of the units, right? And we can look at that, some examples here. In this case, all the onset, all the left edge boundaries, because they've got no marking, they're all mid, okay? So all these initial prominences are mid. And then what you're going to hear is mid to high, mid to mid, and mid to low. So mid to high has a kind of contrast or a surprise meaning.
She took the exam and failed.
You hear that?
She took the exam and failed.
Right? She took the exam and failed. High, surprise, contrast. This one, the mid one, because mid is just continuing, it's just reporting the information, okay?
She took the exam and failed. She took the exam and failed.
She took the exam, she failed the exam. That's it. Low level tends to mean that's your expectation, right? That if you took the exam, if knowing her, if she took the exam, she failed the exam.
She took the exam and failed. She took the exam and failed.
Okay. One of the most important things, if you're struggling to hear some of these differences, don't let that get you down. It's hard when these units are so small. There's two big things that happen when you have a left and a right edge boundary tone, and those are the things I really want you to focus on. What you can do, the first thing you can do is create pitch paragraphs, right? So these are very much like written paragraphs. They're topic based, and they'll tend to start high, go through to mid, and end up low, right? Within each paragraph. So, and here you've got your next paragraph. It starts slightly lower, then lower, and then ends up lower. So if you look at this, the way this works is they're directly connected to how the speaker expresses topic structure, just like it is in written paragraphs. So you have a high pitch to initiate a new topic, a mid pitch to continue a topic, and a low pitch to close, okay? So if you look at this example right here, you've got a key choice right at the front end here that's high because it's the beginning. Then you go mid, 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 and then at the end of this paragraph, you end low. Now we've got a new topic here. So the speaker starts again high, goes to mid, 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 ends low. And then the same in the third one. Okay, starts high, ends low. And then what you get at the end is just the very beginning of the last paragraph. So let's have a listen to how that sounds.
Let's look at the competition. Our main competitor, Benton, entered the market 10 years later than us, but since then, they have grown more rapidly and are now the biggest in terms of market share. Why? Their products are better, sold at lower prices, and presented more attractively. Now, our second major competitor is Zekron. They entered the market at the same time as us. They have a lower market share than us, and their products are sold at slightly higher prices. However, their annual return shows greater productivity. The last major competitor is Mansell. They have a much smaller market share, but their products are sold at the top end of the market at much higher prices. As a result, they achieve the best profitability of the four companies with a much lower turnover. So, what can we say about our own position?
Okay, so hopefully you heard that pitch paragraphing, right? It's interesting because what we know from looking at the research on this, the better the speaker is at this, the easier the information is to understand. The least the speaker does this, if it's a long piece of discourse text where you're trying to communicate a lot of new information, the more difficult the hearer has in understanding. So one thing that's been done is in classrooms, they have somebody look at the notes that the student has written. And what you find is that when there's a high reset, so a new pitch paragraph, students will either write 2, because it's the second point, they perceive that the second point is coming up, or they start a new line. So as soon as they hear it, they hear a reset, they think, okay, this is going to be a new part of the topic or a new subtopic, and they automatically start to do it in a different space. Okay. And if you have speakers that are really bad at this, you find that listeners often have a hard time tracking lots of new information. So we know that it is perceived. We know that it's perceived, it's so fast, it's not perceived cognitively. You know, you don't say, oh, here we go, high pitch, they're about to start again. But we know that when it happens, there's an immediate response from the hearer in terms of understanding information structure. So it's an important aspect to long discourse text if you're speaking over a long period of time. So that's why I said, if you look at it with these little ones, it can often be tricky to sort of really hear those differences. But when you look at how it's actually used in real discourse, this is how it's used, and it's quite easy to hear how you start high and end low and then reset to a new high again. So this is one way in which we use this left edge and this right edge pitch range boundary. Another way, the second major way we use it, is something called pitch concord, which basically has to do with agreement or disagreement between speakers. So agreement, pitch concord, essentially says, if I agree with you, I'm going to try and match your pitch, right? So if I'm a guy and you're a woman, by pitch matching, I don't mean that he's suddenly going to go really high or you're suddenly going to go really low, but that you sort of together if he's at the middle of his range, you'll be at the middle of your range. If he's at the height of his range, you'll tend to respond high in your range. And that's called pitch concord. It's been demonstrated not just in English, but in a bunch of other languages, where speakers will try and match to show agreement and break concord. If you break concord, that implies disagreement. Now, this is not the greatest example, because this was actually an example from one of my students of 2 sorority sisters. But then I couldn't find another sorority sister to do it with me. So I had to do it with Mark. So in fact, it was 2 women who were, and I had the original tape, but I can't use it. So, and one of them says, oh, I got to run. It was so good meeting you. And the other one says, yeah, it's nice to meet you too. Yeah, thanks for the chocolate. And they're both sort of, high in their range going, oh. So we tried to do it with Mark, and he did a good job, but it sounds a little strange. I agree.
I've got to run. It's so good meeting you, Mark.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, and thanks for the chocolate.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
So I think you get the general idea that it's this sort of idea of, if I say, I got to run, it's so good meeting you, and he says, nice to meet you, then it's going to be like, okay, that something's wrong there, right? So this is part of this matching. You can also signal disagreement through concord breaking, and this happens quite a lot. So if you think back to what we were talking about in terms of mitigators, which was, where's our mitigators? Level tone, for example. So if you have a level tone on something like well, and then you break pitch concord, then it's a signal that actually you're going to disagree. So in this case, the second speaker, so speaker A says, I couldn't go, could I? And speaker B says, well, yes, actually, I think you could. And that well is what's called short token, long prosody, meaning it's a warning bell to say, I'm now going to disagree with you. And then there's a concord break as he shifts up in key from where the initial person was. And you can listen to that.
I couldn't go, could I?
Well, yes, actually, I think you could.
Okay.
I couldn't go, could I?
Well, yes, actually, I think you could.
Okay.
I couldn't go, could I?
All right, enough. So, sorry, I didn't mean to keep. I think you get the general idea. So again, when you look at something like concord breaking or matching, this is not something that you consciously think of, but in fact, it's something that we all do all the time. And it's part of the way that we signal that we're in agreement, or that we're trying to be in agreement, that we're trying to be socially convergent and nice to each other, etc., etc. Okay. It's sort of like eye contact and things that you never really notice. Eye contact, gesture, things that in fact you do all the time, but you never really notice what you're doing. But they're linguistic, in this case, this key choice is linguistically meaningful. There's also some stuff on question types and key choice, and to be honest, I just got too exhausted doing this PowerPoint, so I left it, but you do want to have a look at that. And then importantly, at the end of the implications is, what do we know about how this key and termination is manifested in English language learners? Again, most of these things apply to low or intermediate learners. However, it can also apply to high-level learners. You can have high-level learners that have a real problematic monotonic pitch as well. What we know from the research is that, generally speaking, second language learners of English have a reduced overall range. They have a much more restricted range. So if a native speaker has a range between here and here, they tend to have a much more restricted range. Of course, that makes it a little bit difficult to start hearing high, mid, and low keys. Elke Mennen, one of the people that's done this research, thinks that it may be related to a lack of confidence, that the learner is deliberately choosing a lower pitch, because a restricted pitch range. I think it could also be what we've talked about before in terms of teaching induced error, in the sense that this is never discussed. I've been looking at ESL and EFL books for over 25 years, and I've never seen anything about pitch range and about how you can create pitch paragraphs and so on. So it could simply be that we don't talk about it, so they don't do it. Concord breaking, there's been quite a lot of work on this, and everybody agrees that it's not passed as unobserved. Okay, if you break a concord, if you do something like, well, actually, or even the lower, if you go much, much lower, as if to say, I'm not interested in this whatsoever, it will be noticed. It won't be passed unobserved. So in other words, it could affect a relationship between an English language learner and an interlocutor of traditional Englishes, for example. So Anderson is one of the studies that I cite, and she found actually a complete failed interaction due to the fact that there was no convergence in pitch range, and so the British English speaker was misunderstanding how friendly or not friendly the ELL was trying to be. Unintentional concord breaking can also occur due to typical pitch ranges. So this is where we talked about, I've talked about Japanese high choice sociocultural pitch, but also there's a study in here from 2007 of Arabic men that suggests that overall Arabic men speak Arabic higher and louder than a English equivalent male would. Thus, if they transfer this into English and into their interactions, it can be considered to be concord breaking. But of course, it's unintentional concord breaking. They're not trying to sound more aggressive or trying to sound like they want to disagree. It's simply a L1 feature that's now been transferred into the L2, but that can be problematic. So these kinds of problems are what we can think of as adult problems, because everybody knows if a kid is not interested, they're not interested or whatever. But now you're talking about issues that if an adult learner is in the workplace, they can be misunderstood. They can be perceived as unfriendly. They can be perceived as difficult. All these kinds of things that are attached unconsciously to these kinds of choices can be perceived by speakers. So we do want to work with it to some extent. And some of you, when you were doing your lesson plans, I said, you might want to include more communicative activity. And part of the reason that you want to include that, just like chit chat, and part of the reason that you might want to include that is to check these kinds of things. Like, when your student is just supposed to be having a nice, straightforward conversation in which there's some phatic communication, some social bridge building, how is that coming across? Is it coming across as social bridge building, or are there any aspects of their prosody, particularly monotonic key, or too loud, or too high, that are creating a perception that might be problematic for them in another context? All right. And that's what we have for chapter 5. Any clarifications? Or I'm particularly interested if anyone has had any of these experiences with their own students or themselves, actually. None of this sounds familiar.
I think this is very new to me and very interesting, Dr. Picker.
Ah, okay, Ari. Yeah.
Definition is connected to pragmatism. It's very interesting. I just never think about this, and then I think it's important for me to know, because unless I'm aware of this, there's no way I can help students to improve. So this is
Right, that is absolutely true. And that's what I mean by teaching induced error. I mean, if we don't know about it, then we can't communicate it to our students. I also think it's super important to help you understand your own reactions. Like, if you're a native speaker of American English, you can have very negative reactions to speakers of new varieties of English or to international English speakers. And I think sometimes those, more often than not, some of those negative reactions are classified as racism, or the person that's talking as being, uncooperative. just like the example we saw with the Indian women in the cafe. And I think it's easy to jump to those assumptions, and I think we're no different. We'd like to think that we're different. I always like to think that as a teacher, I listen to a person and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't make that mistake. I wouldn't like think that they were sounding mean. But actually our reactions to these things are so unconscious, they're so tacit, they're so immediate, that it's hard for us to work through what is really happening. And that's what I think this kind of information can do. You know, you can say to yourself, okay, this person is really pissing me off. Why are they really pissing me off? You know, because I know they're nice, or I want to, you know, help them come across as being nicer. So what are some of the ways in which I might not be seeing the whole performance in this light? So pragmatics is by far the best way, I think, to understand how this works, because it is a pragmatic reaction that you are having also. Thank you.
I have a question. So we're learning about identifying these tone and prominence and pitch and all these issues. Are the later lessons going to be talking about how to address them? How to?
Yes, that would be nice,
Okay.
wouldn't it?
So,
yes, part of the end of the book is those 2 lesson plans I talked about, in terms of giving you an actual lesson plan of how to look at key or how to look at tone. But I think, you know, but the idea of this book is not it's not like the other book that you have. It's not full of exercises on how to teach it or whatever. It's really designed to just try and explain to you what the system is. So I don't have lots and lots of teaching examples. That said, in each of the activities at the end of the book, at the end of each chapter, should give you some insight into how you might teach it.
Okay. So for instance, the example you gave of children reading a book and it's full of neutral tones.
Yeah.
Would you just recast it so that children hear you using the correct pitch and tone? Or
yeah. I mean, I think yeah. That's a good question. You know, I think in the case of the example I was given of children, I don't think there's anything you can do because they're just really crap at it. So that's just not where their mind is. They're not aware of, but for adults, I think it's super important if you have an adult who has to do a lot of speeches or is reading aloud, and you can tell that it sounds like they're focused on the language and not focused on the people. So for example, this idea of related propositions, if you're listening to them and you can hear them going da 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 da, then you know that you've got a problem, right? So then you can do all kinds of things, including mirroring. Mirroring is something that if you actually look in the TESOL literature, if you pop it on Google Scholar, you'll find it. But mirroring is the kind of thing that you were talking about in terms of recasting, and a lot of people do that with adults. So you can take anything, like I can take, let's say, this chapter focused broadly, and then the student has to immediately follow you and is focused only on copying your tone and key, right? So this chapter focused broadly on the importance of 2 approaches, They immediately have to follow you. It's called mirroring. It's like recasting. It basically says what you have to listen for is the sound of the voice, Not that, you know, you've got the text in front of you, the learner has the text in front of them. What they're doing is trying to copy exactly your tone and pitch. This is particularly good for people that have that related propositions problem, you know, where they're constantly falling. So you can say this chapter focused broadly, and they'll say this chapter focused broadly, and you'll say, no, listen, this chapter focused broadly, and then they have to immediately say this chapter focused broadly. And it can, mirroring can be really a helpful technique. So I think that's exactly the kind of thing you meant by recasting. And I think with adults, it's super useful. Yeah. The other thing that people do is, and I think, I'm not sure if it's in the TED talk at the back, but, oh, well, mirroring is if in fact you don't need to look online, you can have a look in the appendix. That's what my friend Colleen Meyer does. She's talked about mirroring in TESOL classes for 20 years at this point, but she has them do it with TED Talks. So, or an actor or anybody that they want to copy. And so that's an idea of how you can address multiple problems. Yeah. Now, the other thing that teachers often say to me if I'm face to face is, you know, yeah, this is all very nice, but, you know, the students have so much to do, they can't focus on whether they're using falling tone or a rising tone or a, you know, and that's totally a fair point. And in fact, Richard Caldwell and me in this book and in all his work says it's not really an issue of getting every individual one right. It's an issue of having a sense of multiple choices of intonation. So if you sprinkle some fallings, risings, and levels around, you're going to be fine. The problem with learners is they often only have one and not the other one. Okay, so and usually it's a falling tone. So usually they'll have lots of falling flat tones. So just getting them to vary their pitch a little bit is enough to keep it moving. You don't have to spend. Now, with my international teaching assistants, I did spend significant time talking about rising tones because it made a huge difference to the students, so the American students. So I had the ITAs work with saying, okay, well, some of these other things that made the classroom feel more inclusive. And, you know, if you're working with an adult who's a leader, for example, and is coming across as, you know, abrupt, non-caring, then these are some of the kinds of very specific strategies you can use and say, let's start adding in some rising tones. But generally speaking, as long as there's some differentiation, then you're good. You know, you don't have to worry about every individual little one.
Dr. Pickering.
Hello, Ali.
Hi. I think this lecture and the lecture last week has made me think a lot about major influencers. Like, I don't know if you know who Marie Kondo is, but
oh, is she the organizer chick?
Yeah, she's the world-renowned tidying expert, and she's fantastic. And you know, part of leadership is the ability to influence others. And she's amazing because she's getting people all around the world to clean their houses. But I also think it has something to do with her speech patterns as well, when she's delivering speeches in English and everything like that. And I think Trevor Noah has the same intonation patterns as well. Like,
yeah, Trevor Noah is a great example of someone who comes across as extremely inclusive. Yeah,
Yes.
you're right. Now,
It's-
this other girl, woman I've never heard, but now I am going to make it my business to listen to her, Aaliyah. So what is her name exactly?
Marie Kondo. If you type in KonMari, KonMari, everything about her will be brought up.
All right. Yes. So that's absolutely true. And in fact, one of the things that makes a really, I know I keep talking about TED Talks, but a lot of students like to, TED Talks are sort of easy to work with because they're real talks, but the idea is that they try and make them, accessible to everybody. So adult students like them a lot. And I think one of the things, if you start listening to them, that makes a good TED Talk is exactly this kind of pitch organization. So not just choices of rising or falling tone, but also clear organizational structure in terms of spoken paragraphing and so on. Clear indications of when you're finished with an idea. Clear indications of when you're about to start a new idea, not just with gesture, but also with pitch movement and so on. So I think, Aaliyah, you're absolutely correct. And it's worth listening to a few to see, now that you've sort of thought about these things a little more, to see what you can hear, what you can hear in what is happening. All right. Well, thank you guys. That was good. Out of interest, how did you find that? I only looked at your lesson plan, so I didn't look at the work that you did on the chapter, the exercises that you did. I haven't looked at those yet on the previous chapter. Did you find those okay? I mean, did they make sense, or?
I think personally it took me a minute to get used to paying attention to the rising and falling in the tone units, but I think the sound bites definitely helped.
Good. Okay. Yeah, it's tricky to one of the things, I forget, I think it's an activity for this week, but I'll give you a bit of a heads up. I think I've asked you to do it, but one of the things I've asked you to do, if you're familiar with the 20 questions game, where you have to ask to guess who the person is, so who the person has decided they are. So you can say, but you can only ask yes no questions, right? So this is a brilliant way to, because you can say, are you dead? And they have to say yes or no. Or you can say, are you dead? Yes or no. So play it with somebody and see what they, one of the things I've suggested that you do is play it with somebody in your house or something, and try and hear what tones it is that they're using, whether they're using rising tones to confirm or whether they're using falling tones, and see if they mix them up, or if after they get one thing that might happen is after they think they're closer to who you are, they might start using rising tones instead of falling ones, because they're now asking to confirm their own ideas. So there's no right or wrong answer, but it's one way. You don't have to use rising, you don't have to use falling, but it's one way in which you can start to hear what people do and focus, because the the syntax and everything else is so small that you can really just focus on the sound of the choices. So so have a crack at that this week and see how that goes. All right, then in that case, I am done with y'all. So homework is here, reading post and activity 8. As I say, if you have any further questions about the lesson plan and the final 5 lesson plans, feel free to email me. And as questions come in, if I think that they're really useful for everyone, I'll keep passing on the information. Otherwise, they're yours to get started on now. So have a crack at them. All right. Well, I am done. Thank you very much. I will, as usual, stay online in case anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.